you for joining us for this session. I've brought some hydration with me because, as you will all appreciate the irony, I'm a little under the weather while talking about wellness. Life has a way of doing that to you. So as Mike said, we're going to talk about selling wellness and whether consumers really pay for perceived or actual value. So let me start with wellness innovations, because they're an odd bunch. Some of them are really great. Some of them are simply awful ideas from the get-go, and they've really not aged well. Others seemed like a good idea at the time, things like fat-free dressing and saccharin, but they've not aged well either. There we are. Then we have some things that are seemingly good ideas, and they seem to have staying power. Vaccines, juice, vitamins, standing at your desk instead of sitting. I've heard sitting is the new smoking. And then there are things that seem to be relegated to the medical profession and to the idea of a burden and not really something that consumers are interested in for their own health and wellness. Think dental floss or a colonoscopy. However, there are trillions of dollars to be made. This is a seductive area. There is tons of money to be made here. Beauty and anti-aging alone is $1 trillion market. And if you're saying, well, that's not really wellness, fine. There are multiple $100 billion markets, nutrition, fitness, preventive medicine, that I know are really relevant to many of the folks in the audience today. But actually making that money is not straightforward. And the problem is we need to learn how to not keep making the same mistakes. We need to quit reinventing the fat-jiggling machine. This went by a number of names, the Mueller exercise belt. It had a bunch of different names, but it never worked. And if you're looking at this going, this is absurd, obviously no one's going to keep reinventing this terrible wheel. You're wrong. It's been reinvented and reinvented and reinvented. The Ab Energizer, the Ab Force, the Ab this, the Ab that. All of these products have come to the market, people have bought them, and then they have crashed and burned explosively to the tune of more than $100 million in lawsuits that the FTC has required these companies to settle and pay on. So there's a ton of money to be made, but there's risk. That's why we're here today to talk about it a little bit. Now, this started as a talk about wellness, and it is a talk about wellness. But as I looked at the examples that I was using to make my points, I realized it's also a talk about poop. And I'm aware there's been a little bit of poop discussed in other talks, and there may be a little more, and it seems to be kind of a running theme. And for myself, the reason that my talk became about poop is actually pretty straightforward. And this little guy is to blame. This is Emmett. Emmett is my son. He was born on Halloween. Emmett is 5 months old, as he's very proud of showing off. This means a lot of my time is spent thinking about poop. When did Emmett last poop? How many times has he pooped today? What color was it? Things like that. I also spend time kind of wearing it and changing diapers and so on. And poop is really an important part of Emmett's wellness. At his age, pooping is a skill, quite frankly, and a good indicator of how well he is. Are the ins matching the outs, and so on. And for adults, we don't like to talk about it, but poop is also a relevant part of our wellness. So, this is a talk about wellness, but it's also a talk about poop. So, how are we going to get where we're going? We're going to start by making sense of value and of wellness. We're going to try to learn from some past mistakes. And then we're going to try to look to the future and think about innovating around some of those risks and not reinvent the Ab Energizer and the Ab Force. Now, I mentioned we're going to talk about what is wellness. And wellness is really a big kind of squishy topic. Pardon the poop-like reference there. If I were to ask everyone in the audience, I think I would probably get a different answer from every person on what wellness really means. It's a very democratized word. It's very personal. So rather than try to define wellness, let's talk about the outcomes the wellness industry focuses on, because I think we can agree on these. Freedom from disease, longevity, peace of mind, and quality of life. And if you look sideways, they're all really interrelated, right? If you don't die young of a disease, you live longer. You have freedom from disease. You probably have peace of mind if you're not worried about dying young from that disease, and so on. We get clients asking us about all of these very frequently, and they're highly, highly complex topics. Since this is a half-hour talk, we're going to focus on the one that is the most straightforward, and that's freedom from disease. Now, the other part of my concept here is that we need to know how to address wellness, not just define it. And historically, conventionally, we address wellness with medical care. You get your annual physical. If you have an illness, you get a medication, or you have some surgical intervention. But consumer wellness really has to do with reaching the consumer as part of their lifestyle. And that's where things like the Apple Health Kit, Google Fit, and even the recently announced Adidas All Day come in. Many of these are apps. This is really how wellness happens for a lot of consumers. And they all seem to coalesce around the 4 main levers that a consumer can pull to affect their own wellness. Some degree of activity or exercise, what they eat, their nutrition and diet, how much sleep or rest they get, and then most of them include some aspect of mental health, whether it's mindfulness, relaxation, something like that. So generally, these are the tools that companies have to help consumers affect their own wellness. Now, my title mentions actual and perceived value. And if we're going to talk about actual and perceived value, we need to define actual and perceived value. So we'll start with actual value. Now, I'm a scientist. I'm a biochemist by training. I love actual value because it's science and data. It speaks to me. It speaks to my inner scientist and engineer, and I'm sure for a lot of us in the room, this is familiar and comfortable. These are innovations that can measurably and predictably impact freedom from disease. This is a really important thing to have if you're going to sell wellness, right? But it looks like this. Long titles with obscure words that might not mean much to a consumer in journals that the average consumer is not going to see. But these are titles that have to do with things like avoiding obesity and type 2 diabetes and stroke and death. There is a ton of actual value here, but communicating that to a consumer is non-trivial. This is where perceived value comes in, and perceived value really has 2 key pieces. First of all, the belief that something is going to contribute to freedom from disease, and the idea of a low burden or barrier. So, do I believe this will work, and is it convenient or pleasant for me to engage in? One example of this, in the 90s, there was some research that pesticide exposure would contribute to cancer. From this has grown a desire to avoid pesticides, based on the belief that that would provide safety from cancer. Seems straightforward. This has led to one of the fastest growing segments in the food industry today, the organic market. And if you're looking at that going, yeah, the science is still out on organic and whether it's more valuable, fine. But the perceived value is solid, and it's a growing market. There we are. So, we've talked about perceived and actual value, and at Lux, we love to make a framework. Oh, God, we love a 2x2. They're really a helpful way to organize your thoughts in a graphical way, and we are, most of us, scientists at heart, so this fits. So if we imagine perceived value on our y-axis and actual value along the x, we can look at where innovations and technologies align, and we can judge their odds of success, because perceived and actual value can be at odds. But the reality is you need both for sustained growth, and I'm going to tell you why. If all you have is perceived value, you have a high risk of being a fad. We'll get into more of those later. If all you have is actual value, you're going to have an uncompelling solution or a burden. With both, you end up in an area of sustained growth. The bottom corner is obviously left blank. If you have neither perceived nor actual value, I suggest going back to the drawing board. Let's start with the potential for a fad. The money here is seductive. There's no question. You can make a ton of money, but there's risk. We're back to the fat jiggler. But it's not just the fat jiggler. It's things like the Wow brand of chips, which we'll get into in a little more detail in a few moments. It's things like fecal microbiome transplants, which seem to be all the rage right now. There's another bit of poop coming in. 100% juice blends that actually have more sugar than the cocktail variety, but are selling on a very strong perceived value with consumers. These are risky. However, engaging on actual value alone is a losing proposition. Nobody wants to be the dental floss industry. And I mean no offense to dental floss makers, but think about how compelling is dental floss as a wellness product. How fast is that market really growing? How much money is really being made there? Colonoscopies, more poop again, fit into this category very nicely, as do things like sleep. And here, my dear Emmett is helping demonstrate what sleep looks like, because many of us see sleep and getting time for sleep as a bit of a burden. We don't really make time for it, even though it has a very material impact on our health. Things like yoga and relaxation fit here as well. These are things that either they're uncompelling or they're too much of a burden to really drive consumers to engage. If we look at things that have sustained growth, Viagra is a great one. It's got actual and perceived value. The perceived value being the discretion involved in achieving the real actual value there. Vaccines are something that, minus the small contingent of non-science believing anti-vaxxers, have good sustained growth. Things like Orange Theory that combine the idea of Fitbit and the practice of social exercise into real value. And the Mediterranean diet that theoretically might provide better health and longer life. So now that we've got a framework established, let's learn from the past. Let's look at some mistakes that have been made and what we can learn from them. We're going to look at fads that could have the chance to move across into sustained growth, some uncompelling burden situation that could move up by adding perceived value, and then we'll look at an approach that can get you straight into sustained growth. First of all, selling chips on perceived value alone can be risky business. And I'm going to call out Frito-Lay for a moment, but this is an old example that I hope they'll allow, and there's a good story at the end. So, the Wow brand of chips. I don't know how many folks remember, but these were in the late 90s and sold on the claim that they were fat-free or nearly fat-free, and you could eat almost as much as you wanted. I loved the nacho cheese Doritos. It's a weakness. However, these chips contain a fat replacement called Olestra, which was required to carry this warning label on every package, which says, in part, Olestra may cause abdominal cramping and loose stools. More poop. These chips started out with rather high sales, grossing more than $300 million at one point. But this is a pretty serious negative perceived value piece. And they had a threefold sales drop for this brand from 98 to 2002. And by mid-2002, news articles were reporting that Frito-Lay was looking at dropping the brand. Meanwhile, the baked Frito-Lay brand doesn't use a fat replacement with a negative side effect like that. It uses a different kind of production method for the chip itself to have less fat in the snack as a whole, so that, fine, they're not fat-free, but they're a lot better for you than a conventional chip, so you can eat a little bit more. So there, we've balanced perceived and actual value, and this is a cash cow. Today, still, 15 years on from this trouble with the Wow brand, the baked line is expanding and selling very well. So that's a lesson we can learn about fads. Now, for cancer screenings and other kinds of monitoring, it's about barriers. And here's another poop reference, colonoscopies. These are obviously very relevant. There is a lot of actual value in not dying of colon cancer. I think we can all agree. But the perceived value in a colonoscopy is somewhat low. There's a high barrier there, and I get it. PSA campaigns involving Jimmy Smits, Diane Keaton, even Morgan Freeman himself have done very, very, very little to increase the perceived value. Just a smidge, not much. But there's a different approach that combines both. So this happy little creature represents a company that's offering an at-home stool sample and DNA-based test for colon cancer. Do it at home, full of discretion, none of that awful prep, none of that time being under anesthesia. This company grew 20x year over year from 2015 to 2016. It's called Cologuard. Their product is not even as effective as a colonoscopy, and yet consumers are flocking to it as a way to avoid the burden of a colonoscopy. Now, the nutrient industry offers us a look at a situation where best-in-class status has become transient. So if we think about multivitamins, this has been a market that has had sustained growth for a long time. It's really at risk of attrition at this point and of falling into, into a burden position because of the growing perception that whole foods and whole vegetables and such are a better source of nutrition than getting it from a multivitamin. And this is happening even as brands like Centrum have done really incredible work to make their products more absorbed by the body and more palatable. It's no longer only horse pill options. You can have a gummy. You don't have to go with the Flintstone chewables that I knew when I was a kid. There are what should be better perceived values here. But because of this consumer sentiment that's changed, the value has dropped. And this has made an opportunity for a company like Suja Juice, using high pressure processing, to come in and grow 10,500% in 1 year by selling nutrients in a new way, in a different way, using what is really an old and kind of boring technology to many of the engineers in the room. Okay, we've taken a little look at some situations that hopefully we can learn from. And now I'd like to use the same framework and look at the same 3 kinds of situations and see how we could move forward to get around these risks. We're going to start with one of my favorites, gluten-free. So gluten-free is definitely a fad. It's absolutely a fad, unless it's not. This little cartoon illustrates the kind of gluten-free eater I'm talking about. I don't mean somebody with celiac. There's no question. Celiac disease is a disease, and for a small segment of the population, there will be a need for gluten-free foods. However, for the average consumer that has a very vague belief that gluten-free is somehow better for them, they're way up here in this very scary, very risky top corner. And a number of food companies have gone and put a gluten-free label on foods that have been gluten-free forever, don't naturally contain gluten, right? I mean, you open your oatmeal, it says gluten-free. Yeah. Now, this seems like a great idea, right? You make a little more money with folks who just, they're kind of playing at this, idea that this might be better for them. But there's a big, big, fat risk. And that is coming just now. Harvard Medical School researchers have just put out, it was actually in conference proceedings, it's not even published yet, that a gluten-free diet is associated with a 13% higher chance of developing type 2 diabetes than someone who ate a non-gluten-free diet. So this will actually make you sicker. Meanwhile, there's also things like a reduced fiber consumption and vitamin consumption if you're eating gluten-free. There's a hypothesis that the lack of fiber is what's contributing to type 2 diabetes in these cases. So how do we get across to this magic quadrant that we want to be in? How do we get over into the sustained growth category? One idea: fiber. All the benefits of gluten-free without the diabetes, right? You can imagine taking products that are already high in fiber and doing exactly what's been done with the gluten-free label and slapping a high fiber label on there, right? And kind of hedge your bets that way. Or do what some companies are doing and look to ways to incorporate fiber into food products that are otherwise naturally gluten-free. Things like inulin-type fructans, or the various products being made by High Food and Blue Prairie brands. I'm not saying you have to get in here, but this is a multi-billion-dollar market, and if you think you've got a share of this now because you've got gluten-free labels on things, beware. The crash is coming. You don't want to get left on the backside of it. It's like a sideways poop reference, that one. Now, stress management. It's a nice to have, right? At best, it's a way of relaxing. Very few people think of stress management as a way of keeping you healthy. But Gemma will tell you, stress management can impact health in cardiac patients. It can keep you from dying of a heart attack if you have an otherwise weak heart. And yet, this is about the state of stress management innovation today. Stress balls, fidget cubes. I've got a fidget cube if anybody wants to see it after this. It's great, but doesn't do squat for my cardiac health. It doesn't actually keep my blood pressure down when I'm feeling stressed. And I don't think of it that way either. Then we have things like yoga. Yoga has huge actual value. There is no question. I didn't put up all the articles that will show it, but there's a massive impact on your health from doing yoga. But it's a burden. It takes time. It's like sleeping. How do we get up? How do we get into where we want to be, where we can make money? I think this is an opportunity to use wearables to do something along the lines of what Orange Theory has done for fitness and combine tracking and monitoring with practice to create an actual sustainable solution for consumers that they can feel good about engaging in because they can see the impact on their health. All right. How about protein? We've known for a long time a high-protein diet can keep you thinner. If you were to read this lovely long title, a high-protein diet induces sustained reductions in appetite, etc. full stop. Helps keep you thinner. But steak and eggs and classic protein sources, meats, have a little bit of a bad rap. They're pretty high in saturated fat and cholesterol. They're not, quote, good for you overall. So their perceived value has dropped. And really, this created an opportunity that's kind of already been filled by things like Greek yogurt. Greek yogurt is high in protein. Much of it is made with fat-free milk, and so it is non-fat. You don't have the same cardiac impacts, which is great. But there's still risks here. Greek yogurt is really sour if it's plain. So a lot of it is fruited and very sweet. And there's a big, massive risk on the horizon for the US Greek yogurt market in the form of the new nutrition labels that are going to be required in a few years. And this probably looks familiar to most, and please don't try to read it. But what's really relevant is there's a line right in here, really tiny. It says, number of grams of added sugars. Not what's naturally occurring from the strawberries at the bottom of that tub, but the sugar that was added to make the strawberries sweet enough to make up for the sourness of the Greek yogurt. That's going to make the perceived value drop like a rock, which makes up an opportunity for some sugar alternative technologies. And I don't mean the next saccharin or the next sucralose. I'm not saying just go to stevia, because we've seen where that goes with perceived value on those. But things like what Nestle's doing for sugar reduction in the form of changing the physical structure of the sugar so that you need less total sugar to have the same sweet effect. The other thing to think about with Greek yogurt, it's kind of a pain in the ass. It's a cup, you need a spoon, you need a fridge to keep it in. It's nice if you have a place to sit to eat it. It's not on the go. And that creates an opportunity for a whole cluster of alternative products that are high in protein from other sources, like crickets, or quinoa, or pea protein. Companies like Beyond Meat, Products Biosystems, and Equinome are all working on some protein solutions that can be incorporated into other food products and play on this freedom from obesity that you get from eating protein without the side effects of either the red meat cardiac situation or the high sugar you're going to get from sweet Greek yogurt. The Greek yogurt market as it is somewhere in the neighborhood of, I think, $4 billion. There's a ton of money there, but there's also risk. Keep the sugar in mind. Okay, how should this impact your product strategy? I think it's really, really obvious, but just to point it out. If you're down here or up there, move up and to the right. Come to that nice quadrant in the top. It's a good place to be. But if you're up there we are, don't rest on your laurels. Don't get complacent. As I've shown you with multivitamins, there's a huge risk of attrition. Even Greek yogurt, which seems to be in vogue right now, is at risk of attrition in perceived value. You don't want to drop. Keep in mind, interlopers can come from anywhere. Also, if you see a market that has sustained growth and you think you've got a way to make it better and make it more relatable to consumers, go for it. That's an opportunity. You can make a sustained product a trit with what you have. There we go. All right, you've come with me on this journey. We've talked a lot about wellness and consumers and what they really want in spite of what our engineer inside wants to give them, which I totally understand how hard that battle is. But please, as you go out in innovating in wellness, don't underestimate the complexity. We spent the last half hour talking about freedom from disease, and there is a literal universe of innovation out there approaching freedom from disease and the other wellness outcomes. Keep perceived and actual value in mind as you put efforts into innovating in wellness. And please, 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 don't be the next fat jiggling machine. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions.